Welcome to our last session for the week. And I'm in a different location today. I'm actually in the library here. It looks a little bit like I'm in the basement of the library, which is a perfect place to be when you're thinking about dusty subjects like the Odyssey. And today I'm titling this To Hell and Back because I want to make a few comments about Odysseus's trip into the underworld, into death, into the world of death. But before I do that, I want to talk a little bit for a moment about a comparison between Genesis and the Odyssey. Now, there was a scholar, a great literary critic by the name of Erich Auerbach, and he was writing in Germany, unfortunately about the time of World War II. And he also had the misfortune, if you will, as a scholar, to be very much opposed to the Nazis. And because the Nazis didn't take kindly to scholars who were opposed to them. Now, they did something very interesting with him. They didn't put him to death as they did with many, but rather they put him under house arrest. So he was pretty much okay, I guess, except for he was not allowed to have any of his books with him. But he was able to have plenty of pen and paper. So throughout the war, he, without any of his books, wrote an enormous book by the name of Mimesis, Mimesis. It's a fabulous work of literary criticism. And in this book, he surveys many of the great works of literature, providing an interpretation and often in providing some fascinating comparisons and even judgment about works that he liked and didn't like and why. And he very much loved the Odyssey. He thought that the Odyssey was one of the great human achievements in the Western world. However, in the chapter that he entitled Odysseus's Scar, he said something that I think is quite fascinating. I've actually given you a copy of it here. Let's see if I can move over to it here for a moment here. Give me just a quick moment. Let's see if this is it. There it is. It's on page 77 of your syllabus. I'm giving you just a small portion of this chapter. In this chapter, which I would love for you to read, he compares Genesis with the Odyssey, asking himself which of these is the greatest work of literature. Now, what's interesting is that Auerbach doesn't believe in God. He's not a believer, but he does believe that the Bible is the greatest work of literature that he has ever read. Not only that, he believes that Genesis, more specifically Genesis and Exodus, is the greatest literary aspects of the Bible. And so he's going to compare Genesis, if you will, with what he considers to be the greatest work of the Greek world, the Odyssey. And he is going to side with Genesis. He's going to say that Genesis is the greatest work until Shakespeare. And his primary argument is twofold. And you could read portions of this in the passage, but I'm going to sum it up for you here. First of all, the genius of Genesis is something that he calls gaps. Now, you'll notice something about Genesis. You've noticed it probably your entire life without thinking about it, and that is the narrative in Genesis and Exodus and portions of Numbers is written with very sparse detail, incredibly sparse detail, as a matter of fact, but it still has an incredible emotional impact. For example, when we read the account of Cain and Abel, and I've given you my translation of it in the syllabus, but when you read that account of Cain and Abel, you have a fascinating story there of Cain being quite disappointed that God does not accept his sacrifice of his vegetables and fruits, but he accepts the sacrifice of Abel, which is, of course, the best of his flock. And then Cain, in a fit of anger, invites his brother out into the wilderness. And then it says that he kills his brother. What instrument did Cain use to kill his brother with? Did he hit him over the head with a stone? Did he bring a knife with him? Did he just choke him? The text doesn't tell us. As a matter of fact, this happens over and over and over again, that Genesis leaves these narrative gaps where we don't really know some of the details. And Auerbach argues that we feel when we read Genesis something that's almost unconscious as we do it. We feel the incredible need and urge to fill those gaps. Sometimes that filling of the gaps is part of what gives it its fire, because it gives us some room, some imaginative room as readers to imagine how Cain may have killed his brother, or to imagine other aspects of stories throughout these narratives. Now, there are bad sides to that too that scholars will note later, because, for example, Cain, as a result of killing his brother, is visited by God, and God wants to know where his brother is. And Cain says, am I my brother's keeper? And God seems a little angry because God knows what's happened to him and says, his blood cries out to me. And then he puts a curse on Cain, that he must now leave the ground that he loves so much, and no longer be the rural farmer. And Cain is quite distressed by this, not just because he's no longer going to be able to grow things, but because he feels like he's got, a mark on him now, and someone sees him, they're going to want to kill him. And God puts a mark on him. And this is meant to be some sort of protection. What does that mark look like in your mind? How have you pictured that? Is it somehow an image? Is it a tattoo? Well, this is where we can see that these gaps have actually turned out sometimes not always to be healthy, because one of the reasons that American slaveholders, and even before the Americas, they argued for slaveholding of people with darker skin, is they argued that the mark of Cain is that God made him with dark skin. It doesn't say that, but somebody decided to fill that gap in that way to somehow fit a worldview that they had, a very disgusting worldview that they had. The bottom line, though, is it is a marvelous thing, and Auerbach argues, and I love this point. He argues that you can demonstrate the genius of Genesis in that you cannot write any single story in Genesis in fewer words and still have the same emotional impact. Now, you could obviously write it in fewer words, but you can't do it and still maintain that incredible impact that Genesis has. Now, this, when compared to the Odyssey, is almost laughable, because Homer writes in almost the complete opposite manner of the writer of Genesis. Because rather than being sparse on detail, Homer is going to pile detail upon detail upon detail. And he's going to pile metaphor upon metaphor upon metaphor until sometimes, as readers or as listeners, we almost want to say, okay, I've got it. And we often will refer to these as kind of epic similes. because Homer begins this tradition of epics, which of course means a long poem, is having a string of metaphor after metaphor after metaphor. I'm going to give you a good example. In maybe one of people's favorite parts of the Odyssey, and that would certainly be Book 9, where Odysseus and his men, they're a little desperate. It's very shortly after the war at Troy. They're trying to get home, and Poseidon has put a fog, and they can't find their way home, but they do seem to manage to bump into an island. And in the tradition of Xenia, they go and they bring a gift, hoping that someone can help take care of them, maybe give them lodging, and maybe also help point them in the right direction to Ithaca. Instead, they end up at the cave of a giant, a one-eyed giant, a cyclops, a particularly mean cyclops by the name of Polyphemus. And Polyphemus, who takes care of sheep, is very perturbed by these men who are in his cave, and he begins to eat them. He eats a couple for breakfast and comes home that night and eats a couple more for dinner. Well, Odysseus, being clever, realizes he needs to do something so that he can save him and his men. So he comes up with this great plan, and I'm hoping you can certainly see this. I'm going to enlarge the screen here. So jumping right here, and I'm starting right here about line, looks like about 375 on page 222 of the Fagel's translation. But you can just follow along right here. In Fagel's translation, I picked it just because it's really well done. It's an excellent translation, but also really good poetry. Fagel's is not just a great translator, but also a great poet. Now, here, just reading from the Odyssey, he says, "Nightfall brought him back, herding his woolly sheep, and he quickly drove the sleek flock into the vaulted cavern, rams and all, none left outside in the walled yard. His own idea, perhaps, or a god led him on. Then he hoisted the huge slab to block the door and squatted to milk his sheep and bleating goats, and each in order, putting a suckling underneath each dam. And as soon as he briskly finished all his chores, he snatched up 2 more men and fixed his meal." So you almost have this picture of Polyphemus grabbing 2 men, cracking them like eggs. But this time, and here we begin to see the cleverness of Odysseus. "But this time I lifted a carved wooden bowl, brimful of my ruddy wine, and went right up to the Cyclops, enticing. 'Here, Cyclops, try this wine to top off the banquet of human flesh you've bolted down. Judge for yourself what stock our ship has stored. I brought it here to make you a fine libation, hoping you would pity me, Cyclops. Send me home.' In other words, I'm hoping you would have Xenia. But your rages are insufferable. You barbarian, how can any man on earth come visit you after this? What you've done outrages all that's right, because he's broken the law of Xenia." Okay, this is what he means by this. Again, here comes the cleverness. "At that, he seized the bowl and tossed it off, and the heady wine pleased him immensely. 'More,' he demanded, 'a second bowl, a hearty helping. And tell me your name now, quickly, so I can hand my guest a gift to warm his heart.'" So it almost seems here that the Cyclops is changing heart here, that maybe he's going to give him Xenia. And so our soil yields the Cyclops powerful, full-bodied wine, and the rains from Zeus build its strength. But this is nectar, ambrosia, this flows from heaven. So he declared, and I poured him another fiery bowl. 3 bowls I brimmed, and 3 he drank to the last drop, the fool. And then when the wine was swirling round his brain, I approached my host with a cordial winning word. Notice this. It's delicious. So you ask me the name I'm known by, Cyclops. Coming over here to the second page, page 223. I will tell you, but you must give me a guest gift as you promised. Nobody. That's my name. Nobody. So my mother and father call me, all my friends. But he boomed back at me with his ruthless heart. Nobody. I'll eat nobody last of all his friends. I'll eat the others first. That's my gift to you. So in other words, his act, his mocking act of Xenia is that he'll eat him last, as if that is a gift. And then, of course, he slumps into an unconscious stupor, and because he's drunk. Here's where we see Homer now beginning to show the details that he's capable of. So judge right here, about line, I don't even know what that is, 4:13. With that, he toppled over, sprawled full length, flat on his back, and lay there, his massive neck slumping to one side. And sleep that conquers all overwhelmed him now, as wine came spurting, flooding up from his gullet with chunks of human flesh. He vomited, blind drunk. Ugh, disgusting. You could imagine, though, Genesis might have said, with that he fell asleep. And that would be the end. Now, here comes, look at these details. Now, at last, I thrust our steak in a bed of embers, to get it red hot, and rallied all our comrades. Courage, no panic, no one hang back now. And green as it was, just as the olive steak was about to catch fire, the glow terrific. Yes, I dragged it from the flames, my men clustering round as some god breathed enormous courage through us all. Hoisting high that olive steak with its stabbing point, straight into the monster's eye, they rammed it hard. So they take this gigantic steak and they ram it into his eye. Now it would be, Genesis, of course, would have just said, if we took the steak and put out his eye. And that would be enough, and our imagination would fill those gaps. But no, Homer fills it for us. So listen to this. Hoisting high that olive steak with its stabbing point straight into the monster's eye, they rammed it hard. I drove my weight on it from above and bored it home as a shipwright bores his beam with a shipwright's drill, that men below, whipping the strap back and forth, whirl, and the drill keeps twisting faster, never stopping. So we seized our stake with its fiery tip and bored it round and round in the giant's eye, till blood came boiling up around that smoking shaft, and the hot blast singed his brow and eyelids round the core, and the broiling eyeball burst. And if that's not enough, he goes on, he's not done. Its crackling roots blazed and hissed. As a blacksmith, he's not done, here we go. As a blacksmith plunges a glowing axe or adze in an ice-cold bath, and the metal screeches steam and its temper hardens. That's the iron strength. So the eye of the Cyclops sizzled round that stake. So we definitely get this picture that the stake is going into the eye. I mean, he's popping out the eye, the eyeball, and the blood. It's boiling. And he's using so many different metaphors here to describe this one act that in Genesis might have been a phrase or at most a sentence. Now, some of you might say, well, I think that's pretty good writing there. But I tell you what, Homer leaves no room for any imagination. Brilliant? Yes, absolutely brilliant. Unmatched? Pretty close. There's not much out there that's as amazing as that. However, it's definitely not parallel to Genesis, he would argue, and I think I would agree with him. So I would love to hear what you think about that. But I'm going to post a video now about the afterlife. And now, one of the interesting things about the Greek afterlife is that the Greeks did not believe, as many other cultures believe, as we believe, that there is some sort of reward at the end of life for those who are good, or at least those who achieve salvation. For the Greeks, everybody, good and evil, it doesn't matter, they all go to the underworld, the same place, ruled by Hades. Sometimes his region is even referred to as Hades. It doesn't matter, they all get the same. There's no real reward or punishment. The only thing, though, is that you can bring with you two things. One is your what's called kleos, Kleos, or honor. We don't really have a great word for it, but honor. So if you've been honorable in battle, if you've been honorable in your dealings with other people, if you have been honorable just in life and to other individuals, that honor carries with you to the underworld. It doesn't necessarily give you a better spot in the underworld. It doesn't give you a better room or a better bed. It doesn't give you better food. But you do get the admiration of those down there. And there's something that the Greeks felt that satisfied them at that. And the other thing you get, of course, is the honor that's brought to you by your xenia. So if you have not showed honor in xenia, then that becomes a dishonor, and you are looked down upon in the underworld. So it really has to do with you carry your reputation into the underworld. There's nothing more that you get from that. If that sounds very unsatisfying, then you're not the only ones, because the Romans, centuries later, who will borrow almost every aspect of the Greek religion, will look at this and it will be unbearable to them. And so they too will agree that everybody goes to the same place, but this will be a place where there will be levels. So you will have a place of Imperium that's beautiful, that with trees and gardens for the good to go to. And then you will have a place of desolation, a place of isolation, a wasteland for those who have not been particularly good, and then levels in between. And this, of course, is where we also get the idea that will become a kind of a medieval Catholic idea of different levels and layers of heaven, different layers of purgatory, and different layers of hell. We get this actually from the Romans trying to make sense of the Greek underworld that is just unbearable to them. One of the questions I would have is, do you believe, and I'm going to make this the question, and that I've posted that I want you to respond to, do you believe that one's view of the afterlife affects how that people or peoples live in this life? Does the Christian view of the afterlife affect how Christians live? For example, in the Buddhist notion of the afterlife, there's no God in Buddhism, but there is a sense that you're working your way toward a oneness with the universe, and what comes after life may be another shot at life until you do finally achieve this oneness with the universe. Does that affect how you live your life? Most religions have a kind of reward and or punishment at the end. So the Greeks are very unusual in this. And so I'd love to know your thoughts on this. And one of the things that you'll notice in the next video that I'm asking you to look at, a very entertaining look, is in many ways how odd it seems to us from our Christian perspective, but just try to rethink our world and how it would be if that's our idea of what comes afterwards. Anyway, I'm looking forward to your responses. You're all doing a wonderful job, and I look forward to hearing what you have to say. Thank you for your patience as I'm kind of working through Moodle, trying to dress it up a little bit, trying to learn some ways to make it a little less boring looking, because it bothers me as one who loves art, the lack of aesthetics sometimes it's there. So I'm going to try to fix that. So anyway, thank you, and I'm excited to see what you have, and I would love to hear some of your thoughts. So thank you so much.